All right. Well, let's get started. I want to thank all of you for being here this afternoon / evening. So today's event stems from a book that's still relatively hot off the presses. National Parks, Native Sovereignty, Experiments in Collaboration. And so this book was published earlier this year by the University of Oklahoma Press. As the Blackboard says, you can buy a copy for yourself outside of the room. So keep that in mind. So the Center of the American West is thrilled to welcome the volume's 3 co-editors. So our own Brooke Neely, as well as Christina Gish Hill and Matthew J. Hill. And we're also very, very excited to have several of the contributors to this volume, including Natasha Myhal, who worked with Brooke on CAW's Indigenous Connections collaboration and earned her PhD in ethnic studies here at CU Boulder. So welcome back, Natasha. Also like Professor Clint Carroll, who is joining us in one of his, few moments of sort of spare time, since he's taken over as director of ethnic studies, and he's been a wonderful contributor to the Center of the American West Board of the Faculty of Affiliates. And we're also very, very excited to welcome several other contributors who have ventured here from as far away as New York, Finland. We have one contributor getting piped in via Zoom. So people are coming in from the ether even. And so tonight's event is very much in the spirit of the mission of the Center of the American West. CAW's mission is to bring people together to explore the ongoing complexities and challenges of the Western United States through education, research, programs, and projects. And so I want to thank Brooke, who took the lead in not only in sort of organizing the book, but in organizing tonight's symposium. Also want to thank the other Center of the American West team members, Tamar McKee and Ryan Lewick. And then I also want to thank our co-sponsors. These kinds of events, of course, take sort of contributions from various parts of the university and mailing lists from various parts of the university to really pull off and to make a success. So I want to thank the Office of the Chancellor, and in particular Associate Vice Chancellor Benny Shendo. I want to thank the Department of Ethnic Studies as well. And I also want to thank the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies. And there's more seats up toward the front, so don't be shy. And of course, we know sometimes people need to leave early, so don't be shy about that either. And then a final co-sponsor, not from Buffland, but from Ramville, would be Colorado State University's Public and Environmental History Center. And so I'm going to turn things over to Jared Orsi in a moment. And I've known Jared for a very long time. I actually first met Jared when I was shopping around for graduate schools. I was a prospective student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I still remember Jared's kindness and generosity in welcoming me to Madison. And he really sort of helped me imagine what it would be like to come to graduate school there. So continue to be very grateful for that. And Jared's done all sorts of wonderful work over the years, for which I for one am very, very grateful. He's the editor of the Public Lands History series at the University of Oklahoma Press. This is volume 7 in that series. Jared is a former state historian of Colorado, and you're still directing the Public and Environment? Yeah, okay, so he's the current director of the Public and Environmental History Center at CSU. He's the author of many justly acclaimed articles and books, including his newest, which is entitled Peoples of a Sonoran Desert Oasis, Recovering the Lost History and Culture of Quito Baquito. Did I say that right? Yeah, Quito Baquito. It's fun to say. Jared was recently named editor of the Western Historical Quarterly, which is the journal of record for the field of North American Western history. And so Jared's going to moderate tonight's symposium. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jared and the panelists.
Thanks, Thomas, and also congratulations to you as the new director of the Center for the American West. That's a great honor. Again, my name is Jared Orsi. I come to you from that other university up the road. And I am not an author or an editor or a contributor to this book, but I'm the series editor, a book series editor at University of Oklahoma Press. And I'm really very glad to have gotten to work with these outstanding scholars who have produced this fine book. When you think about the National Park Service and Native peoples, you might think of a very fraught history of dispossession and erasure of Native cultures in order to make way for the National Park Service. And we'll talk about some of those things in our discussion this evening. But this book is also a story of successes. Each chapter examines a different relationship between a park or a handful of parks and a tribe or tribes, and tries to look at what has worked, what hasn't worked, and what can we learn going forward. One of the things I was most interested in when I first found out about this book is the breadth of different kinds of parks and different tribes that these scholars work with. In this volume, you will find big famous parks like Rocky Mountain National Park, and you'll find parks that perhaps you haven't known about that are just hidden gems that you'll find out about today. You'll find nature parks and historic parks, battlefields and the like. You'll find Eastern parks and Western parks. We'll even cross over into Canada for one park. So there's a broad coverage here, and yet there are some common themes. We can learn some things about how the National Park Service and tribes can successfully collaborate when we read each of the chapters collectively. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about how the evening will work, and then I'd like to introduce my colleagues on the panel. I won't stand up the whole time, but I had to stand up to see who was in what order here. So this is going to be conversational. So we have three themes that we'd like to cover. One is history and theory surrounding relationships between tribes and parks. One is what the future might hold. What can collaborations look like in the future? And then the first one that we're going to look at is the personal paths of authors into this work. I haven't provided questions ahead of time to the authors. They know the topics and the themes, but we haven't provided questions to them. The reason for that is to try and make it a little bit more conversational. The first theme, I'll ask each of the authors to describe how they got into this work and why it excites them. And then with the other themes, all of the authors, y'all will respond to that first one. And then with the other themes, I'll kind of cue you and ask you questions, and we can kind of go back and forth. And if I fail to ask a question that you think is important and you have something to say, please just jump in, raise your hand, throw something at me, whatever. So you don't have to wait for me to call on you. All right. So let me, with that, let me introduce my colleagues here on the panel. So on the far right is Rani-Henrik Andersson. Rani, or your left, my right. Rani, I think you get the award for the person who came the farthest from University of Helsinki in Finland, where he is a professor in North American Studies. Next to Rani is Jackie Gonzalez, who is the founder and owner of Marandola Research, LLC, right?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
And next to Jackie, we have Natasha Myhal. Again, welcome back to CU. Natasha is in Indigenous Environmental Studies, which is within the School of Environment at Ohio State. Welcome, Natasha. Good to have you back. Next to Natasha is Clint Carroll, who is the chair of the Ethnic Studies Department here at CU. And in the middle is Brooke Neely, who did a ton of work to organize this event. So thank you, Brooke. Brooke is research faculty at the Center for the American West. And Christina Gish Hill, next to Brooke. Christina Gish Hill is in the World Languages and Cultures Department at Iowa State University, where she's in the Anthropology and Indigenous Studies section. And last but not least, we have Matthew Hill, who is a consulting anthropologist and an independent scholar. Joining us on Zoom, do we have Lance yet?
It's a little deeper.
Hello, Lance.
He's texting. Christina's texting with him as we speak.
As we speak. Oh, there you are. Hi, Lance. Good to see you.
Make sure I can see you.
Lance Foster is the tribal historic preservation officer for the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. And so he'll be with us for the first part of this evening. So welcome, Lance. Glad you could join us. All right, so I want to pose the first question to y'all, and I'd like to invite the editors. So raise your hand if you're an editor. It's Matthew, Christina, and Brooke. I'd like to invite you all to talk to us about what was your vision? How'd you get into this book? What was your vision for the book, and what attracted you to it?
So sure. So the book has a little bit of an origin story, like many projects do. And this origin story began with the National Park Service and a request, you could say a request for proposal that they put out. They wanted an anthropologist or some anthropologists to go out and do a study of Mount Rushmore and the Black Hills and Native people's relationship to the Black Hills and Mount Rushmore. So a very somewhat unusual project. These are called EOAs, or ethnographic overviews and assessments. And an EOA, an NPS EOA, in case any of you ever get the chance to work on one, they seek to document the cultural and historical associations between indigenous or traditionally associated peoples and cultural landscapes of parks within the National Park Service. And since all national parks, as we were just talking about, are built on native lands, native peoples have important relationships to these places. We like to say cultural and natural, but native peoples don't make those distinctions. So part of these projects is to really understand what those relationships are to these important sacred landscapes. So I got involved in this project in, I think it was 2016, 20 so timeframe. You can see that books always take a lot longer than you think they're going to take. And I found out about Christina and Brooke through a lot of sleuthing. Christina had worked with an anthropologist on a similar EOA, looking at Wind Cave National Park in the Black Hills. And so I was looking at her magisterial study called Home of the Bison, and I was looking at the graduate students who had worked with Pat Albers on this project, and there was Christina Gish Hill. So I looked her up, and she was at Iowa State, and we connected via email, and we met at an American Anthropological Association meeting in Minneapolis, and the rest is history. And then Brooke, I found out about looking through like dissertation abstracts, and discovered that she had written a dissertation at UC Santa Barbara on the politics of representation at Mount Rushmore during a period in which Mount Rushmore had its first Native superintendent, a Mandan Hidatsa named Gerard Baker, way larger than life human being, and who created this thing called the Heritage Village there at Mount Rushmore to introduce an Indigenous perspective at Mount Rushmore, very controversial. So that was kind of the origin. After the EOA, we did this project together. And then, maybe Brooke, you could talk about the convening we had in Hartford, Connecticut for the NCPH. That event, I think, was also very instrumental. So
yes, yeah, well, and so what we started realizing was that there were a lot of different people doing this sort of work in different areas, and we wanted to bring the cases together to put them in conversation and to try to encourage this sort of work more broadly. So we've met up at various points at conferences, but it's also through a lot of the applied work we've done. So like Natasha and Clint and I have worked on this project, Indigenous Connections at Rocky Mountain National Park, for years, but we also never wanted it to just be about Rocky Mountain National Park. We wanted to think about it more broadly in terms of the park system in general. So that was part of the motivation. Hartford, Connecticut was one of many panels we did where we realized there's actually people interested in this. And so that was when we started figuring out the path to this.
Yeah, and I think we were really excited to see the interest as we were going to conferences. And we really felt, you know, if we were able to produce a book that is open and accessible to multiple audiences, then potentially that could be really useful to a lot of people.
I'll just slip in one other quick thing is that we just noticed that there wasn't really a how-to manual out there for how to engage in collaborative work with tribal communities involving the National Park Service. And we had a lot of hiccups along the way. And so we thought this volume would maybe also be a bit of a yellow brick road for others trying to do the work.
Yeah. So we've heard a little bit about how scholars might get interested in the subject of park and tribal collaborations. Hey, Lance, can I invite you to give us your perspective from the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer perspective? What got you interested in working with national parks?
First of all, as a THPO THPO, we are funded through the National Park Service. It's just like SHPOs, State Historic Preservation Offices. We get funding through that. That's the other thing. I actually worked for the National Park Service for a number of years down in Santa Fe and up in Alaska in their cultural landscapes program. So I was familiar with it. I was familiar with the very fraught history that the Park Service has with Native folks, like up at Glacier, a lot of the claims and mythology that people have of these pristine landscapes that were not part of our different tribal pasts. I mean, we all live by stories, whether they're native or non-native or whatever mythologies that we work with. And then the final kind of direction, since we are the first tribe to have a sister park relationship in the National Park Service. Our sister park relationship was with Myhal and National Monument, and we are actually one of the affiliated tribes there. When we put together Ioway Tribal National Park using Red Cliffs, Front Bay as kind of a model, which was very encouraging. We just saw that as the next step. So we worked with the Fire Cloud and all the folks up the chain and to try to get that going. Not for funds, not for recognition, not for anything other than to help us how the Park Service does things and see what lessons we can learn. And see if we can deal with some of the things that happened during FQ Mountains, since FQ Mountains had that controversy between two superintendents, one stealing the bodies of our ancestors for decades while trying to figure out the mystery there. The other one is for some of the sexual unstickable weights that another superintendent did. So there's a lot of things to be repaired. I'm not sure that they're fully repaired yet, but we're working toward that. So those are the things that caused me to be interested on multiple levels working with National Park Service.
I know we've only got a few more minutes of your time, so I want to take advantage of that if I could. Could you say a little bit more about effigy mounds and what happened there and the ways in which that creates a kind of a lasting wound for tribal peoples?
Well, as most folks know, the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act 1980 and as amended later. You had a bunch of paranoia in the world of archaeology that the Indians were coming for their stuff. And it was the idea of one of the superintendents that you separated the bodies from the stuff, keep the stuff. There's a whole thing about affiliation and unaffiliated. So he hid folks in boxes in his garage for decades, and it was a mess. And it took finally the superintendent after another so superintendents, there are like 4 superintendents to even try to figure out the problem. So Phil was the last one, and she decided she wanted to do an entire building. She did a bunch of projects about doing proper clearance. There was a lot of problems and divisions within the park at the time. People's careers were damaged, and it was just a mess. So what was really great was when they finally did get a superintendent there, Jim Devstad. He took the bull by the horns and sat down with the tribes and said, "This is the situation. We need your help to try to work through it." And of course, the tribes were upset, but they appreciated the directness that he was going to take to try to solve this problem. So Jim started trying to heal that, and Albert DeBoe too, who was their Lakota guy, to try to figure this stuff out, and a lot of other things. Like I just saw one of the Rangers who had his career kind of battered by the situation. There's a lot. I've been asked to kind of write a book on it, and I'm kind of writing it. Just tell it as full as I can that people will talk to me about. So it has to be documented. It has to be documented. The whole story. I just think that, and now because there were some folks who applied who were Native, for some of the positions were opened up, for the superintendent and for the new liaison, that ended up being non-natives to be put into those positions. I think there have been a couple steps back. It's not the fault of current people who were selected for that, but there's probably in the regional leadership, they still didn't show up for when they declared the census against Tom, and they didn't face the reality. I think there's an avoidance in the Park Service to just engage with Indians. I mean, we're scary, I guess. So we just want to try to solve it. We can't fix the past, but you can try to fix the future if you deal with it the right way. So we're still plunking, going ahead. In fact, I just came from Mountains National Heritage Area. I spoke to them, and then at the 75th anniversary of the park, we went up there and helped them celebrate. And like any relationship you're stuck in with like family, you can't walk away from that. Well, but we definitely try not to. It's the Native way to try to stick it out. That's your relatives. So we're trying to make it work, and some parts will get better. And we do need to get more tribes engaged again. But I don't know. It's hard. It's difficult.
It sure is difficult. And thank you for kind of underscoring for us some of the reasons why when you have things like that happen at effigy mounds, where human body parts are being stored in a National Park Service employee's garage, you can kind of get a sense of why this relationship between tribes and the Park Service is really hard. And as you said, it's a difficult relationship to build. Let's see. So Natasha, can I put you on the spot next? Since Brooke had told us about the Rocky Mountain project and the Indigenous connections. You were involved in that too, I think, right?
Yeah, so I was just coming to Boulder when I got an email. Actually, I think it was from Clint inviting me to a conversation that was happening up at Rocky Mountain with the Center for Native and Indigenous Studies, and then tribal representatives from Cheyenne, Arapaho. And I don't believe there were any youth representatives there at the time. But we all met at the park and kind of talked about ways the park could better engage with the tribes that are connected to that area. So that was my introduction to the project. And then eventually I would kind of come on a little bit more formally as a research assistant to kind of help Brooke and work with the tribes in that.
And Clint, you're next. You've been name checked twice as being involved. So how did you, although you've done a lot of, you've been with Indigenous Connections, and then you have a chapter here on Buffalo River.
Yeah, so it was through the relationship between the Center for Native and Indigenous Studies, which I was a part of. I sat on the executive board for quite some time, and then was looped into the Rocky Mountain Connections project through the Center of the American West and the collaboration there. And as Natasha mentioned, worked as kind of a partner entity, or a part of a partner entity to advance that collaboration. Going back to the Buffalo National River chapter in this book that I've contributed with. So the story, are you asking me the story behind that chapter specifically? Sure. Okay, I'll try to be brief. So, hello everybody. So I feel awkward just launching into this in English, and maybe you felt the same way, but Osio Nigadawo, Ukahati Sikwanio Hadawado, Alegali Liga, G. I am a professor in the Ethnic Studies department, but I'm first and foremost a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and I work and have worked for quite some time with my tribe in Oklahoma. The Tahlequah is the tribal capital. The story of the chapter that I was a part of and contributed to this volume has to do with the longstanding relationships with elders and knowledge keepers that have formed over the past decade, really. They call themselves the Cherokee Nation Medicine Keepers, and they're invested in perpetuating land-based practices and knowledge, as well as the land on which to practice that knowledge and perpetuate that among future or younger generations. The story about this work, the chapter represents a piece of applied anthropology, and I would say by extension, because of how I'm situated, applied Indigenous studies, using and building upon those relationships of trust and responsibility and mutual obligation, in concert with coming full circle to one of the people who actually got me inspired to do this type of work in the first place, a non-native, but highly influential to me and many other students, anthropologist at the University of Arizona. And he's the lead author on the chapter. His name is Richard Stoffel. Be celebrating his career at the end of this year. He's retiring and has worked with countless tribes across the country, a lot of whom are seeking to establish their connections to the lands that national parks have subsumed and continue to occupy, but in a partnership way. And so this is the applied aspect to the anthropology that he does, as well as the other co-author on the chapter, Mike Evans, who is one of the regional anthropologists for the National Park Service, and co-authored, was a significant force behind the rule in the Federal Register, and I think this was 2012, 2014, somewhere around then, that allowed for tribes to approach national parks to establish an agreement to gather within the boundaries of those parks. So I'll kind of wrap up to this question because I know we have many other folks who need to speak, but this aligned not only with the relationships that I had worked to develop and establish with my elders in community, but also with their goals and their visions for the future to expand access to places that address the compounding effects of land loss within the reservation, as well as the climate shift and climate risks that we're dealing with today that have to do with when you have limited access to lands within the reservation boundary, then that's the risks to being able to perpetuate cultural practices are compounded by the actual climate change that we're experiencing that threaten the plants within those islands of property of tribal trust lands, essentially. And so Buffalo National River is in northern Arkansas. It's about a 3-hour drive away from the tribal capital. So depending on where you live within the reservation, it takes some time to get there. But the paradox was that you have a national park that, yes, was established actually on treaty land. So the other added complexity to this story is that Cherokees, as many of you know, were relocated from our ancestral homelands, at least those who reside in Oklahoma, what is now Oklahoma. So those lands that Buffalo National River actually occupies today are not our homelands. They're Caddo, Quapaw, Osage lands. But they have Cherokee people have historical relationships to them. The knowledge of the plants that grow within the Ozarks has been not only learned over time, but there's a lot of similarities between the Ozarks and the homelands or the Appalachian Mountains in the southeastern part of the United States. So we were thinking about this not only in terms of our historical relationships, but how those relationships enable Cherokee people to continue practicing medicine ways, food ways that allow us to call ourselves Cherokee people in terms of our relationships to the land, even though they're not our homelands. So all of this was a matter of thinking, aligning the work that I had done with the medicine keepers and their vision with the opportunity that was presented by Rich Stoffel and Mike Evans, who, as I said, I worked with as an undergraduate through an honors internship and research project. And so it's really representative to me of this kind of full circle in terms of what happens when relationships are centered first and foremost in any type of research.
Thanks, Clint. I think we will be coming back to this concept of homeland. So thanks for raising that. You're next because I am dying to know how somebody in Finland gets interested in the national park system and Native American peoples. Although you're in a department of North American studies, so you're not the only one. Tell us how that works.
Well, yeah, it's a long story. Thank you for having me. First of all, it's great to be here again. Yeah, for me, the story starts like 30 years ago when I've been working with the Lakota ever since late 1990s. And the national parks came along a little bit later when talking with the Lakota about Black Hills especially. And you can't kind of understand Lakota history and culture unless you have the understanding of their relationship with the Black Hills and Wind Cave. And later on, I started to work in California with the Chumash, and I started to see a pattern of something missing in national parks, and that led to one thing to another. And then I started to look at this from a global perspective, and we actually published a book called Bridging Cultural Concepts of Nature, Indigenous People and Protected Spaces of Nature a couple of years ago, which has a global perspective on this particular issue. I mean, we have similar issues in Finland with the Sami people and national parks and in New Zealand. So it's really a global thing that I'm kind of bringing a perspective into. This particular chapter comes out of my research here in the United States with the Lakota, Chumash, and Haida, and I find it interesting. I'm trying to develop some kind of a framework for what I call re-indigenization of national parks, how different stages of re-indigenization happens. Like Wind Cave is a certain kind of stage of that, whereas the Haida are much further along in bringing indigenous voices into the management of the park. So that really interests me in many levels, and I'm working on that for the next few years, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, you've got 3 parks and 3 tribes in your
the global perspective. So that gives you,
yeah,
a lot of case studies to work on. But it's a really important and interesting topic. I think it's definitely worth pursuing.
Great. Jackie,
Mhm.
how did you get interested in Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail?
Well, so I come at this from a little different angle. I'm trained as a historian, as an academic historian. I worked seasonally for the Park Service doing kind of frontline interpretive things for a while. But then I got hired by a company that does, it's called Historical Research Associates, and does work for the Park Service on contract. So kind of like the EOAs that Matthew mentioned, in the historian discipline and history discipline, the Park Service contracts out administrative histories of each of their units that tell them institutional history, with the idea being with the big federal bureaucracy, someone loses track of 30 years ago, no one knows why someone made that decision. So there's supposed to be tools for future managers. So at HRA, they had won a contract actually before I got there to write the administrative history of the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. And because I had a lot of experience at the Park Service, I started working on it. What became really clear, there was documentary research and also a lot of oral histories we did for the projects. With Park Service staff, some of who were non-native, some native, also many tribal partners. It became very clear that the Lewis and Clark bicentennial, so 2003 to 2006, was a real singular moment and unique moment in which the Park Service sort of relinquished control of the narrative, which is something the Park Service is not often good at doing. During that bicentennial, there was a 3-year traveling exhibit that went all the way from Washington, D.C. to the Pacific Ocean that a lot of the Park Service planners really wanted to celebrate this history, but they, and don't want to get too into it, basically like through a lot of feedback, they hired Native people to run the trail to really plan this and created a unique platform where anyone could come and speak and tell their own stories about how what Lewis and Clark meant to them. And it was actually kind of a beautiful moment of understanding and empathy, but then it also just kind of went away when the bicentennial was done. Partly this thing that kind of went through the whole country and finished, not really place-based, just this ephemeral thing. So my chapter is really a historical study. I wasn't there, but I try to foreground the voices of people who were there and try to use it as a case study of what went well, what didn't, and what can we learn from it.
So this is a fun thing about this panel and working on this book for me. None of us have the same titles or same academic or scholarly affiliations. We have world languages and cultures, we have North American studies, we have independent scholars, and yet all of us came from different paths. All of us came to be interested in this question of parks and tribal relationships. I want to move on to our second theme here. And this theme is partly historical, it's partly theoretical. We heard from Lance about why the past is a painful subject for Native American peoples when it comes to the National Park Service. Matthew, your work is on Devil's Tower. You're both an editor and an author in this book, and as an author, your work is on Devil's Tower. Mount Rushmore, excuse me, Mount Rushmore and the Black Hills. I don't know why, I think I was.
The title, the cover image.
Excuse me. The Black Hills is one of the places where this difficult past where the pain lingers to the present, it's where it's most palpable and most stark. Can you tell us a little bit about the Black Hills and the history of Mount Rushmore and tribal peoples, and maybe how tribal people see it?
Sure. So Mount Rushmore is very different type of site from other native parks like Yosemite, for instance. It's a site where basically the images of 4 presidents were carved into the rock near a very sacred site to Lakota and other native groups. Site known as the Six Grandfathers. So in doing this work, it was very challenging at the start. You know, to be honest with you, I was embarrassed to speak to Native peoples about their perspective on Mount Rushmore, given the desecration that had been done through the creation of this site. And I really struggled. Like the first part of the project was more historical, like the history of the Black Hills, this history of, you know, treaty making and settlement and mining and tourism development and so forth. As long as we were dealing with archives, it was a lot easier to do the work. But when it actually came to the point of having conversations with people, you know, I was really struggling with that. And a couple of things that were helpful. So one, I mentioned Gerard Baker, who's this larger than life character who was the superintendent at Mount Rushmore and other controversial sites. And my first conversation was with him on the phone. And he basically said to me, don't shy away from controversy. And that was his whole philosophy of managing national parks as a Native person. He said controversy isn't negative. So, you know, he really thought that there was a place for fomenting controversy, put a bunch of teepees at the foot of Mount Rushmore, right? Which is like, for a lot of people, it's, you know, next to, I don't know, whatever, in terms of celebrating, you know, US patriotism and all this kind of stuff. And so just other people like Joe Watkins, who was the head of the ethnography's Choctaw program, the National Park said use it as a conversation starter. And then Pat Albers, who Christina studied with, said, you know, ask people what they do in the Black Hills. Like, you know, people go to the Black Hills today, you know, for recreation, for all kinds of purposes, you know. Start having conversations with people about their relationships with the Black Hills. And Christina said, you know, yeah, let's start with the Black Hills, right? Let's not start with Mount Rushmore, right? And that was really helpful because when we started having conversations with folks about the Black Hills, the significance, places that were important to them, inevitably the conversations got into painful topics about displacement and settlement and so on and so forth, and tourism. And then we could start talking about Mount Rushmore more in that context. So let me just pause there. Maybe Christina, I don't know if you want to add anything just in terms of our approach, but.
Yeah. So one of the things we focused on as well was that we made it very clear that we want to talk with people and provide space for people to share their just everyday experiences in relation to the hills, and that we weren't coming looking for sacred knowledge or to talk about ceremonies or anything like that. We're just interested in people's everyday relationships, those lived relationships, and people could share whatever they thought was appropriate. And I think that was really essential. And also, I mean, I knew going into it that it was going to be really painful, but I think just to kind of underscore the challenges of it, the people that I sat down with and interviewed, when they spoke about Mount Rushmore and when they spoke about the loss in relation to the Black Hills, where they continue to travel, you know, frequently, right? They would literally cry. And so, I mean, the pain was really very visceral, right? So, I mean, I think it's challenging, but also really important to have a space for people to be able to share that.
Jackie, how did Native people respond to the Lewis and Clark bicentennial?
Yeah.
There's a similar kind of colonial story there.
Yes. Well, it's funny. So at first, and I kind of talk about it in the chapter, the Columbus quincentennial was not long before that, and there had been a big backlash across the Americas, which the Park Service was pretty aware of. Despite knowing that, the Park Service really bumbled their way through things in the 90s as they started planning and offended a lot of people. But kind of actually saw that and brought in Gerard Baker as the superintendent. Gerard kind of is larger than life in a lot of this. But Gerard was able to really reach out to people and say, look, we want to provide a platform for everyone to tell an uncensored story. The Park Service has broken many promises to you, I am not going to break that promise. And people knew that he had been at Little Bighorn before during a really controversial name change. And people knew that Gerard was going to stand by his word, and they trusted him. And actually, there's some excerpts from oral histories in my chapter that people straight up say, like, once Gerard got hired, okay, we'll play ball, like we'll do it. And so what the concept that he came up with was called the tent of many voices, and said, come and say, what was life like before Lewis and Clark, during, what has it been since, and what does the future hold? And as long as you talk about something there, you can talk about whatever you want. And so people could really come in and talk about their own priorities, their own how the history of colonial expansion in the United States had affected them, which really made people. And you could choose not to be recorded. You could choose not to be censored. It was like a place of trust that had been missing a lot of us.
I think that underscores a little bit what Lance was saying about the importance of hiring Native people into the National Park Service. That having the right people in the right places can really make a difference. Gerard, of course, is such a forceful personality and somebody that people can trust, that made a difference. So in addition to stories of dispossession, like at the Black Hills, or going back to the westward movement that Lewis and Clark helped launch, there's another kind of ways in which the national parks have excluded Native peoples, and that's through erasure of their stories. And so, Brooke and Natasha, maybe I'd like to turn to you, because Rocky Mountain National Park, we all go there. We love the soaring peaks and the blue alpine lakes, and the wildlife. There's so many elk and moose and bear and things like that. And the park is great about telling those stories, but your chapter talks about some brush and pine and aspen structures in the forest that testify to other kind of treasures at Rocky Mountain National Park. Can you tell us about those, Brooke and Natasha?
And then, and you also, I wrote down Rocky erases Native peoples on my notes, so thank you for that.
Okay.
Well, and the other
I got a
thing
telescope there.
yeah, exactly. So one thing that I think is, you mentioned that there are sort of historical parks, cultural parks like the Mount Rushmore or battlefields or forts. But a lot of what national parks are known for are these quote unquote nature parks. And so much of what is involved in creating a nature park is erasing the peoples who have had longstanding connections there. So at a place like Rocky, and not only is it that they've been erased, but at a place like Rocky and in Colorado, you have tribes that have been forcibly removed far from the boundaries of the park. And so engaging with those tribes is that much more challenging because of the pain of that removal and just the logistical challenges of bringing people together to try to do work to improve it. So this project was primarily focused on changing the stories told at the park, the interpretive and educational portion of the park. So different from the Buffalo National River case, which was focused more on plant gathering and sort of access to resources. This was more about the stories that are being told and the ways that we're trying to get folks who go to Rocky, not to just see the message, but to also understand the people that connected there. Would you like to talk about how we actually did some of that?
Yeah, happy to share some insights and reflections. I think, what was interesting about my sort of participation in this project is that we weren't just working with one tribe. And so, I think just to preface with, every Native nation is unique and their relationship to place is different. And so I think that makes work like this hard sometimes to get concrete answers or a systematic approach to interpretation. And so working with Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations, I think it was at times somewhat delicate to really honor the ways that they wanted to tell their story and have that be sort of not filtered, like in the past it had been filtered or told through non-Native eyes. And I think there's more of a push and evidence that Native nations, and their own, know their history better than we know it. And so they should have that agency, and authority to tell their story. And so my role as, so I'm Ojibwe, and these aren't my homeland. So my sort of role in this project was to help sort of facilitate the writing of what the park called resource briefs, I think, for each tribal community. So it kind of involved a lot of back and forth conversations with each of the THPO offices, kind of gathering sources that they felt comfortable, for us, like looking through them, and then creating drafts and having this back and forth with what we had written. Some partners we worked with, they wanted to take the lead on writing the draft, so we happily let them do that. So really trying to find the balance of how do we tell this story. And then, something that I remember from that project that was really impactful was that visitors were actually going up to the park rangers and asking, like, what are the Indigenous connections to this place? Like, people want to know, and the park couldn't really answer that in a way that was useful for these visitors. So I think projects like this are really important for awareness, because not everyone is going to take a Native American Studies class, and the way that we engage with the public, especially in these sites where people go to recreate and they just think, oh, well, this is just a site for me to go hike and spend time outside. Well, no, actually there's this entire history there and contemporary connections, like Brooke has mentioned. But through removal and just displacement, if you don't necessarily see a tribe like right next to the park, it doesn't mean that they're not still having a relationship with that space. So yeah.
And that's why I think everybody, all park staff ought to read this book, so that they are equipped to answer those questions that they get. What is the Native history here? Let's see. So we've gotten a sense of some of the ways in which people have been removed or their histories erased, but that's not the whole story. So Rani, you've got 3 parks, and they show some promise. Can you tell us about those parks? And they kind of range from interpretation all the way up to like actual co-management. So tell us about those parks and where the hope is.
There's plenty of hope. I can come to a really good place to the end, but let's start with the Wind Cave or Onio Shoko for the Lakota, which is the place where the Lakota people were born in the Black Hills. And when I first visited that site maybe 20 years ago, there was absolutely nothing about the Lakota, absolutely nothing, or any other tribe that had relations to their area. But maybe a few years ago, I was talking to my Lakota friends, and they said, we should go back to the hills, to Wind Cave. There's something new going on. And I went and talked to the rangers there, and now they have a interpretive sign by the entrance to the cave and what it means to the Lakota, and also an exhibit down there. So I call that a stage 1 of re-indigenization. The interpretation, Lakota stories are part of the interpretation. But there has been problems because they actually the Park Service approached, I think, 20 tribes, but only the Lakota replied to their requests. So only the Lakota stories are told in that part. So that's one level of kind of inclusion of Indigenous perspectives. Then the other case that I've been working on, I don't like to call them cases because it's about people's lives. So, but are the Chumash and the Channel Islands National Park and Marine Sanctuary, where the Chumash were completely kind of removed from the islands. There are 5 islands, very important for the Chumash, place of their origin, and they were kind of removed from the islands in the 1820s. And part of the islands, especially one of the islands, is owned by a nature conservancy, the others are by the National Park Service. So the Chumash have not had access to the nature conservancy site for almost 100 years, until the early 21st century. Yeah. So my friend, Chumash elder Roberta Cordero, started to develop all kinds of collaboration with the National Park Service, starting from building a tomo, a Chumash traditional canoe, with the National Park Service and NOAA, and they kind of sponsored that, and that developed into a Chumash maritime heritage center or something like that. And now they are doing these annual treks, canoeing treks to the park, and the National Park Service is included, and NOAA. So it's starting from a small thing, building a canoe together, into a situation where the Chumash now have a permanent seat in the advisory council of the national park. It's still an advisory role. It's not that the national park has to do what the Chumash want, but there is a genuine effort by the Park Service and NOAA to do that, to listen to the Chumash, and their stories are told in the park. And as a tourist, if you go to Channel Islands, you are introduced to the Chumash. So that's kind of a next level of inclusion of Indigenous agency, if you will, in the Park Service. However, the Chumash only a few weeks ago were able to create their own Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. The Biden administration just approved it 2 weeks ago. So there's now a new marine sanctuary. It's huge, going all the way from Santa Barbara to Monterey. And that's the whole idea, is to have a joint management of the park, but the premise is always Chumash stewardship. How the Chumash see the environment, the sea, the water, the landscape too. And that's like a very good, promising case for how Indigenous people and these agencies can actually work together for co-managing a park. It's in the starting phase, so we don't know what happened, but the problem there is that there are 12 different Chumash bands, and only one is federally recognized. So the government has to work to recognize part of the tribe, which is an inland tribe. They don't have a relationship with the water space like the coastal bands have, who are not recognized. So that is a really problematic situation, and we'll see how that works. And briefly, in Canada, the Haida people and are co-managing Guayhanas National Park together with Parks Canada. And that started as an initiative from the Haida in the 1970s. Gradually, treaty after treaty, they came up with a management plan in 2018, I think, that they call Land Sea Management Plan, that goes from Haida traditional knowledge. All the things in the park are based, it's a small park, only maybe 15,000 people visit the park a year, maybe a few more. It's so remote, but everything is done from Haida perspective. All the zoning and everything that, ecological zones and whatnot are done based on Haida tending practices in that particular area. And that, I think, is one of the best case studies here in North America of true collaboration that actually works. They have a archipelago management board that consists of Haida and Park Service members, and they actually do things well together. So to conclude that, that's a good case here in North America, but one park that stands out in all of this globally is the Urevera in New Zealand, or Aotearoa, that has been completely returned to the Toho and Maori in 2014. That park is no longer a national park, it's an indigenous park. So that is a thing. I could quote my friend Brad Coombs, who is a Maori as well, but he says there are dangers to this too, that when we talk about collaboration and co-management, that it actually happens the way Indigenous people, the priorities should be Indigenous priorities, not the park's priorities, not the tourists' priorities. So there's a lot of complications here. He warns us all for not creating a stereotype of noble savage again, He actually, I could quote it from the book, but he just said, gotta be careful that it happens and through Indigenous priorities. So it's not just talking about things, it actually should happen.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there are plenty of good things going on in it.
That's amazing. You've actually got 4 stages there.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
So Clint, are you optimistic about this historic agreement for gathering plants at Buffalo River? And do you have any sense of where in Ronnie's 4 stages, what's going on there is happening? He talks about interpretation and advisory role and sort of really driving the park in the Haida case all the way up to something becoming an indigenous park.
It's complicated, and I'll just allude back to not only the emphasis on relationships, but by extension, and relatedly speaking, that the history and the connections to Buffalo National River is not exclusive to Cherokee people. In fact, you could take that a step further and say that kind of stage 4 goal is not really a goal because of that. It's complicated. It's wrapped up in colonial histories. We do have a tribal park within our reservation, which is also not our homelands, but that's our jurisdictional territory, if you will. So complicated, right? How do you carve out these types of conservation enclosures that benefit the people and are intended to be reciprocally beneficial to the land itself, while acknowledging forced histories or histories of forced displacement that have ended up creating a situation where you're home, but you're not in the homelands. So this idea of, you know, tribal national parks, I think is absolutely the ultimate goal. It just gets complicated, especially when you talk about Buffalo National River, which, as I mentioned, was treaty land, but even that history is complicated because that was treaty land that was deeded to, if you will, the old settlers, quote unquote. That's a faction of Cherokee people that relocated in advance of what we know as the Trail of Tears in the late 1830s. So it was a faction of the tribe that was negotiating a treaty with the federal government, but not necessarily in accordance with the Cherokee Nation in the homelands. So all of this is not really easy to answer, but it's also, I want to emphasize three things. That first, the agreement that the Cherokee Nation has established with Buffalo National River does not preclude, for example, Osage people, the Osage Nation, also establishing an agreement. It's not an exclusive agreement just for Cherokee people. It will require a separate process. We could argue about that being a colonial process, but that leads me to my second point, which is a concept or a framework that we were putting forward in the piece in the book of strategic engagement. So how do you strategically engage with, for example, Buffalo National River, knowing all of these complexities, but doing so because you're making an act that is for Indigenous futures and is also, as I said, reciprocal for the land itself. So my third point is this two-way relationship, and something that I've just been really impacted by seeing how our elders are treating this process. And that not only is it encoded in the agreement itself that Cherokee people will have the opportunity to, as you say, co-manage or inform the stewardship plan or the management plan of Buffalo National River, but within that act of gathering, of taking from the park, there is an act and an intention and a goal of giving back to the land that the park represents. And so before we even talked about taking a first plant, is the elders said, what are we going to bring to plant? What are we going to bring to contribute to this place that, again, paradoxically, and these are my words, represents a protected area. So you look around the boundaries of Buffalo National River, you've got agricultural development all over the place, right? So acknowledging that there is a strong component of quote unquote protection, but also what has that protection resulted in terms of the native dispossession, the lack of native presence to continue those relationships that themselves are a part of healthy lands and ecosystems. So I just wanted to mention those two things. Those three things is the non-exclusivity, the strategic engagement, so politically, environmentally, in terms of envisioning Indigenous futures, and then, lastly, this two-way relationship. Even though you have this right, as I say to my classes and students, like, it doesn't mean that the right is exclusive of the inherent responsibility that is encoded in that right.
One of the parts of your chapter that I found most moving is actually before the chapter starts, when you quote that Cherokee elder who says that when I go into the park now, it's like coming home. Okay, so I'm glad that you underscored strategic engagement. That is a theme that runs through all of these chapters in the book, the opportunities for Native peoples to engage with the park on their own terms, to achieve their own ends, and the need for National Park Service staff to recognize that and to, as Jackie, you pointed out, sometimes relinquish control of a narrative or a management practice or something like that. Let's see, I have a million more questions, but in the interest of time, I want to move to our last theme. And really, I'll just ask one question. You don't all have to respond, but anybody who wants to can. And that's about the future. There's a fraught history between tribes and the National Park Service, and yet we've seen some opportunity or some examples of potential hopeful signs of collaboration. The last 4 years has kind of been a little bit of a golden age for parks and tribes collaboration. Deb Haaland, who is the first Indigenous U.S. Secretary of the Interior, has launched a number of initiatives to foster these kinds of collaborations. The park has also been, Park Service has also been overseen by a Indigenous Park Service director as well. So you all opened the book with Haaland and Chuck Sams, the director of the Park Service, shaking hands. And you go from there to say, this is an auspicious time for us to explore these collaborations. Both of them will be leaving office in the near future. I'm wondering, is the time still ripe, or has the moment passed for collaborations? Ronnie.
Yeah, I just want to give you a global perspective. It's not all about America always. So I personally try to look for positive collaborative cases, just to change the narrative a little bit. It's not to say that there are no difficulties. There are a lot of difficulties and complications. But I would like to say that despite of what happens here, there are places elsewhere where this collaboration will continue. And for example, Sweden is Finland is not actually, but Sweden is an excellent example of collaboration with the Sami, and New Zealand, Australia too. And there are things going on in Asia that are actually, there were some things going on in Russia as well, and nobody gets to go there anymore, or wants to go. But so from a global perspective, there is a lot of good things going on, and what happens here, I'm not going to say anything about that. It's a political thing that you know better than I.
I would just speak to the part of the challenges of this work has been navigating an enormous federal bureaucracy. So even in the golden era, which I'm not even sure, I think it's going to take a while to figure out if this was in fact a golden era, but I think, and it started well before Deb Haaland and Chuck Sams, and it is a part of a larger wave of pressure by tribal nations to do this sort of work and engage in sort of the work that they want parks to prioritize. So, but I think my hope at the moment is that because of that federal bureaucracy is what it is, that a change in administration can only do so much. And the different parks are able to continue. For the most part, we watched in the last change of administrations, our Indigenous Connections project started during the first Trump administration. And by gosh, we were able to do things. And I remember when Zinke came, he didn't even know many of the policies of the Park Service or federal land agencies. So that's my hopeful take, which I'm sure a lot of us don't. Maybe we don't all have hopeful takes.
I'd like to say real quickly too, kind of on that I think that one thing, I was rereading this ahead of today, and one thing that struck me throughout the book is that all of this, so many successful examples are really person to person, human to human, and people just trying to understand each other. And I think on that level, who's at the top of the bureaucracy doesn't necessarily matter.
Yeah, because those personal relationships continue and they're really powerful. One thing I've been thinking about in relation to this as well is that Native peoples have been through so much, removal, settlement, encroachment by non-natives, assimilation pressures, And yet, right, those nations, those peoples have survived, and not only survived, but continued to maintain their relationships with their traditional landscapes and with their sacred lands. I've worked extensively with the Northern Cheyenne people. Even during removal, Cheyenne people were going to the Black Hills, right? Like literally under the radar of the US military, right? So, people continue these relationships. And I think, I find that very inspiring. And to me, we just have to continue our good work regardless.
Another thing to build off of that reminds me of what you were saying about the HIDA and Parks Canada. The progress that you're seeing now, you said began with HIDA initiatives in the 1970s.
Yeah.
So that's 50 years, that's half a century. For 8 or more years, doesn't derail that long arc necessarily. So thank you all. I want to open it up to questions or comments from the audience. What would you like to ask the authors and editors of this book? Yes, Paul.
Great panel, and somebody who's getting older, I feel like it's a great example of scholarship mattering to management and to people's lives. So I think that's pretty inspirational. I have one quick and one longer. So I'd love to hear people talk about David Troyer's publication a few years ago. A Chippewa scholar who wrote a really influential piece in the Atlantic, arguing that we ought to give the national parks back to Indigenous peoples. Something that I teach regularly in my classes. It's at once kind of a crazy idea, and then you just say, well, why not now, right? But the other is, it dawns on me that the National Park Service is quietly one of the most important organizations that have been doing history in our country. They have somewhat reluctantly across their history had to take on the fact that they are now in charge of a lot of historical sites. They're in charge of a lot of historical interpretation. I don't know enough about the inner workings of the park to know how they feel about that these days, but I'm wondering a little bit how that sort of conflicted mission between protecting wilderness and doing history has seeped into these conversations that's been sort of a productive part of it.
I'll just reframe the question, or not reframe, but restate it out loud. There are two questions for you all. One is about the idea of land back. Should some or all national parks just be returned to Indigenous peoples? And the second one underscores the way in which the National Park Service is a really important entity in the United States for doing history and educating people around history. And how has its mission of preserving nature and doing history, how have those two things seeped into the collaborations? Did I get that, Paul? Okay. Who wants to tackle that one?
I can try.
Go for it.
Because I have several Indigenous friends, especially Basil Braveheart, who is Lakota, and talking about Wind Cave, he says that we are happy the way it is now. And we are debating amongst ourselves what kind of knowledge can be further shared with the audience or tourists. And he was realistic about, they're not going to get the Black Hills back. So he was realistic. The other one is Brad Coombs, the Maori friend. He says that returning, he likes the idea of the Rivera being returned to the Maori. But he said, this is not what all Maori tribes want. They know they have not the capabilities of running a place like that. They want the land for sure, but they are also realistic. The Rivera is a great example of how it might work, but all tribes have not the capacities to do it. So that would require a lot of capacity building in the communities. And then, of course, like Yellowstone, to whom would you return? So it's really a huge issue, but that should be the goal, of course. But how to do that in a sustainable way?
I like I mean, the provocative nature of it, and even the hashtag land back is important to move the needle
Sure.
and spark a conversation. And we can look at too, can't recall exactly where I had this conversation, but it was along the same lines, and we're talking through, well, look at Bears Ears, for example, as a 5-tribe coalition along those lines of creating a protected area. And so I think it's possible. It is complicated. And in terms of infrastructure, that's also, it just raises the question, like, what happens to the concept of a park? And I allude to this too in, the work that I've done on tribal national parks. They are using a concept to do very different things. And so I don't want people to take away that what will happen or what would happen, for example, at Rocky Mountain, is that it's same thing, different faces running the show. It would radically change the concept itself, and that would be a really amazing thing to witness, but it wouldn't be without its dialogues and deliberations.
Yeah, and I think, for example, Te Rivera is not a national park.
Yeah.
Like you and I know a national park. So they are changing it to a Maori place. So that's, I think, the goal, not to create a national park run by Indigenous people. If the land is back, then it's back. Do whatever you want with that. It's yours. That's, I think, the goal. We need national park. It's very special.
Yes.
So, when I went on a work trip, I forget how long it was, but it was to go meet up with some people in I think it was Salt Lake City. And I was wondering how that tied into the book.
We talked about this book there.
Yes.
We went to Salt Lake City to talk about this book in particular.
Brooke, could you repeat the question?
So she's asking wwhy her mother, who's me, and how that relates, why I abandoned her. But we talked, so this book, I mean, it's been an opportunity to talk with so many folks. So we went to a National Council on Public History meeting, and we've just gone, there have been so many people working in both public lands and in museums, and just all sorts of folks from a range of arenas that are able to talk. I mean, this doesn't just apply to national parks, which is partly what's been.
Yeah, and it's been really, I was there too. It's been really exciting to be able to see all the different work that is going on in relation to public lands and access and shifting relationships between public lands and all the different publics. And I think, I mean, that's the one thing I'm really excited about this book, is that it's been able to spark these conversations.
And I think with David Troyer's piece, I mean, I think you can have a range, you can have land back, you can have more radical approaches to pushing for tribal sovereignty. You can also have, I don't think these things are necessarily mutually exclusive, because sometimes even the press kind of wanted to put this in opposition to land back efforts. And I would like to think more holistically about it.
And I'm sorry, just to add to that, I think when you're embarking on these sorts of collaborations and projects, I think it's important for the park or the museum or whatever entity is kind of working with the tribe to consider for themselves what they can give back to the tribes, right? So we've talked about NAGPRA and these mandates through laws, but also to take the time to think creatively when you're working with tribes, to ask them about how this project can support their community and what their goals are. And maybe that goal is land back and they want to, or it could be strengthening community language revitalization. There are so many different initiatives, I think, that fall under land back that, as many people have already said, it's a great, way to kind of frame these conversations. But yeah, another way to think about it.
Yes, sir.
I'll add a comment. The audience doesn't know, but few people here know. 27 years, National Park Service. Federal law enforcement officer. I have standards to meet to be federal law enforcement officer. Physical, medical, training, thousands of hours to be in law enforcement, search and rescue, wildland, structural fire, interpretation, EMS. My beginning was the Ute Tribal Park. Eventually moved on to Mesa Verde National Park, but I'm second generation. My father got started in the 1970s when my tribe decided that they would take some of their lands and turn it into a tribal park. And the Park Service, in collaboration with my tribe, they've been asked, they sent my father and a few other tribal members to Grand Canyon, because at the time, there was a program called Ranger Skills. Ranger Skills was the entry level to teach people to become rangers, and also the permanent people. My father was not a permanent Park Service employee at that time, never did. He became a seasonal park ranger after that training program, with the intent of eventually going and working in the tribal park. His journey went a different direction, and that's another story. It's important in my history, but at that point in time, I learned that being in the Park Service was very similar to my lifestyle of living on my reservation, a huge land base where I could travel and visit and learn all the things about archaeology, the cliff dwellings, archaeological material, as well as nature. At a certain point in my firefighting career, I had an opportunity to go and get my training and become a permanent law enforcement ranger. I worked in 14 national parks throughout the Western US. But the thing is seeing this material here is valuable, because one of the things I look at in my career was it was NAGPRA that has been the genesis of all that we see here now. It was when that came on board, that federal law, it directed federal agencies and any entity that received federal dollars dealing with funerary objects and human remains. We heard about that story about, is it effigy mounds? Yes. I, at that time, also was coming up in the system. I had good managers who saw me as a field ranger, a journeyman, who had important duties to carry out every day as a field ranger. They took the time and said, Don, because of your tribal background and your ability to be able to understand some things, we're not going to keep you in the field anymore. When time comes for meetings, consultations, or tribal representatives come, can you take the time and we'll pull you off the schedule and you can meet with these tribal leaders? I grew up in that. But what I learned is that consultation really started to occur on a federal level. Eventually, it's worked down to state parks, and other entities have been now consulted. So I hear this from the mid-90s or 90s to where we're at today. It's an important thing, and I see that it's a valuable tool, because you are going to be the people that may be in those positions, and you may end up being responsible, but know where some things began. And that's what I'm telling you as a law enforcement officer, as a park ranger, because I have my Ute tribe. I'm Ute. This is my homeland. I know it. I travel it. Every day I go to different places. The Ute country occupies 5 states. That's my knowledge that I know. But getting back to the Park Service stuff, I'm a Ute tribal member, but I also consider myself a green and gray tribal member, because the Park Service and the tribes are stewards of the land, that commonality. And it's important because through anthropologists, linguists, and other people, we find those opportunities to be able to connect. The Chumash people, you talked about some issues with them. I would recommend learning the language of where they come from. Yeah.
Because if you do that, you will realize that the Chumash, by language, are relatives. Because the Uto-Aztec language came from the south, Mexico area, and worked its way north and became the Shoshone, all the Paiutes, some California tribes,
to the Utes, Comanche, and Hopi. When you can learn something about tribal areas, you can read about it, but I'm telling you, a key is language. We don't talk about that. But that's important when you were talking amongst, because then if you're to bring somebody from another area that they can find commonality and learn those things, like in my world, water, ba, P-A-A, ba is water. But if you go and look at the anthropology or something, you will find that term sits with the Paiutes in some of their words, some of their terms. And again, you try and find that commonality. And that's where I go when I deal with tribal members. And that is an important thing. The Black Hills, oh my goodness. We know title is important because each one of you who own property, you need to have clear title. Black Hills doesn't have clear title. So as a tribal member, I would talk about it from that perspective, because I'm talking about property owners, because I own private property where I come from. So I know that that's important. Tribal members are still, and it's not just a physical location that's just the Black Hills. Is it Inyakara, which is just to the west of the Black Hills. That is an important site, but the interpretation needs to be talked about that Custer etched his name in that rock in that area. Those are the things that tribal members, if they come to understand it in their interpretation, it helps them know more about the Black Hills other than what the Park Service teaches. Buffalo River. You talk about a confined area, those are geopolitical boundaries. I want you to know this is Indian country. We need to start talking to our tribal people and elders and youth. This is Turtle Island. Use the terms that we know from different people, from the Hawaiians all the way to the East Coast, because we need to talk about things that are painful. When we talk about the Pilgrims in Plymouth, when they first arrived, those first people that were going out in a boat and searching for water because they had no fresh water, they found Corn Hill, and that's on Cape Cod. And Pilgrims go on, they have a tremendous story in America about Thanksgiving and all this other stuff. I'll tell you now, because I read it through and went to these places myself. Corn Hill was looted by the Pilgrims. They took funerary objects with them. They also took food storage items with them. I've gone through the literature and I've never found a point where the leaders of that colony there ever gave back to tribal people. I've traveled. I've learned as much as I can. This is an agency that's important. And even among tribal people, I have a Navajo gentleman who was a park interpreter. He would take off his flat hat and clip palace. And the audience who comes from all around, and keep this in mind, it's a cultural resource park. For a brief moment, a half a day, or a couple hours, the public has come to open their minds to another group of people that lived here. That was an opportunity that you just don't have experience in Yellowstone because it's a natural resource park. But the Navajo interpreter, his name is Clyde Benally, he was so good that people would come back to the park and they would see me directing traffic, myself being a ranger, law enforcement, and they saw, oh, Clyde, when are you going to be going down and giving your interpreter? That's how popular he was. When he wanted to talk to me, he would take his flat hat, he would turn it over, and he'd show the top of it. And on top of it was the indentation of that felt hat. And he said, this is arrowhead and the symbolism of the four directions, at the four worlds we occupy. He brought in that tribal side to the American public, to the international visitor. The point of trying to get Park Service people to hire tribal people, it's a very difficult situation. In my world, I pursued this because of the standards of being a ranger. And I got it and I finished it. And I ended up in management. I was not just a journeyman park ranger that you sit in the field. I ended up as a chief ranger in a national park. a national park is not just a national monument. There's a difference in these kind of things. I was responsible, and at that point in time, tribal people would come in and they say, finally, we see somebody who's made it to management. I want to spend more time with you guys, but I thought I want to let you guys know that from my perspective, from this seat, as I listen to these people and I hear the stories, if you can, I would say it's a plus. I'm eagerly waiting to read the book because your stories are in addition to what I learned in my stories. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. You raised a lot of really important points there about language.